Okay.
We are live.
There's still something else I wanted to check on, but I forget what it was.
I think I ran more races 2 days ago than I did like in the month before that. So
you're in. Oh, okay. I remember what you're saying, that you weren't racing at all.
what's up, Jovu?
What's up, Jovu?
You're here early today.
Yeah. I sent him a message earlier today. I was like, yo, come watch.
Nice.
No, he was saying, like, I thought he was going to be out having dinner right now. Yeah, no, racing has been really slow today, though. Like, really slow.
What's going on, LJD?
What's up, Dito? What's going on, man? Jesus.
Starting off strong.
You know what? My daughter started Girl Guides, or not Girl Guides, brownies. I don't know. What do you guys have that in the States?
Yeah.
Girl Guides?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it's cookie season, so I'm gonna be eating this entire box of cookies tonight. And,
is it that time of year again? I don't even remember.
Yeah. Well, this is her first year, and Team David. That's all right. Yeah, so it's that time of year. I'm only disappointed because it's only the chocolate and vanilla ones. They have like these nice mint ones that I really like.
Thin mints are the way to go.
Thin mints. Yeah. So, what was I saying? Oh yeah, just like racing is really slow today. Picked up a new horse though, so that's kind of interesting. I don't know. I
keep buying horses.
I have a hard. Yeah, I mean, I have a really hard time looking at the current market and not picking up like good value deals.
In my blood. Yeah, there's a lot out there. I mean,
I blame my blood. He usually twists my arm into being like, "Hey, we should get this horse," and like, okay.
That Mariner horse you picked up, I'm a little jealous.
Man, that's probably the deal of like, I don't know. I can't remember getting a better deal on a horse than that one. 0.15 for that horse is insane.
Sean, what's going on, man? Appreciate the resub, brother.
Hey, Sean, what's going on, bro? How are you? Yeah, let me actually. Mariner. This isn't Mariner. Yeah, ZED5 Zabo exclusive for 0.15, and it was basically even in odds. I believe it was with heavy. So I mean, what's up, Lucky?
Hey, Lucky.
Thanks everybody for stopping in. Anyway, just an insane, like there's some insane deals for racers right now if you are willing to take the time to go through the market. And I mean, I think we're going to talk about that on stream today. A lot of people kind of ask how we evaluate horses on the market to buy, and racers especially. And so we're not going to tell you specifics. Like, I'm not going to give you the filters I use. I'm not going to be like, this is exactly what I do. But we're going to talk about the tools that we use to evaluate horses against the field, and how you can use your knowledge of the racing system and how horses work to evaluate racers. And if you use, like, honestly, it's more of just like a time consumption thing than it is overly difficult. Do I own Ray Del Mundo? No. I don't have that kind of capital, but I am running it for a friend right now, even though he is being a little donkey. Ray Del Mundo, that is.
Hey, Alpha, what's going on?
Retro Valley, said Alpha. I don't know Retro Valley. I was gonna share one of my screens here. This is the horse that I just picked up for Ragnarok. That I picked up. Sorry, that My Blood and I split on. Lucky Royale. Oh, good luck, man. You probably won't need it. Ray Del Mundo has been absolute trash lately, so I'll pull up his thing with share screen. Window. We'll go to this.
So we've got a little group that's joined us. We're a couple minutes in. So
yeah, I was just going to quickly show this one thing, and then we can jump into the content if you want. Is this Thor? Yeah. So this is the horse we picked up today. You can kind of see how I drill down. So he's doing pretty well. I mean, he won this one on 72 stamina. So he's pretty strong so far. He is having a hard time going down though. And then oh, what is it? Look, this is Ray Del Mundo since I started running him. This is what I have to deal with.
And to be clear, you're trying to win.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not trying to down him. I'm putting him in $50 races, and this is how he is repaying me. So anyway, that's Yep, down-classing him with $50 races. That's pretty much how I like to down-class all my horses.
Pure profit. So appreciate you guys jumping on. CJ hinted at what we're going to be covering kind of later on, but we wanted to kind of start with talk a little bit about the NASCAR announcement and see if you guys have any questions or comments there. And then talk a little bit more about some of the racing data that we presented last week or 2 weeks ago. I'm not sure, but we've updated that. We've also looked at, by class and by buy-in and some cool little stats there. We'll talk a little bit about that. We're seeing some pretty interesting things over the last week or two. And then, we'll cap the stream off with talking about kind of summarizing what we talked about last week, and then, really jumping into, what CJ was talking about earlier, looking at, evaluating racers and how to use some of the racing information that we presented, distance preference and, odds. There still are odds floating around out there. And then, placement patterns and things like that, and how to combine that and look at racers. So, Amanda, I hope so. I mean, they still have till tomorrow to push it out to hit this week, right? So, we'll see what happens with the stamina update. We're not going to hit too much of that today, but hopefully, with if they do get a little bit more traffic this weekend, we'll have that new racing environment out there, and we'll see. But again, we've for lack of a better phrase, kind of beating a dead horse on fatigue and stamina. We still think that's the most important thing right now.
Thanks, Dirt Dog.
Hey, Dirt Dog. Yeah, thanks. So jumping into NASCAR, CJ and I have both been kind of tied up this week, but we wanted to talk a little bit about the announcement that came out.
I didn't realize you turned on the auto mod on our chat. It just modded my message because I called myself a massive redneck in response to Dragnet's comment, but it didn't post it, and now it's moderating me. So
I'm gonna allow it. There you go.
Oh, there that looks way worse than because it's bleeped out or whatever. But whatever.
Yeah.
It says I'm a massive redneck for the record.
So for NASCAR, I'm not going to make a comment on that, but for NASCAR, they announced this, kind of an expansion of the partnership that they announced a little while ago, and the big thing here is they're releasing these ZED passes, which certain NFTs have passes like this that give you kind of expanded benefits. They don't really talk a lot about what's offered, but they do talk about future in-game utility and special perks. So we can only imagine what that could be. Obviously there some of these pictures show skins, so it'll be interesting as they kind of develop that, what that could look like. And so the main thing is these ZED passes, which they're going to release. They say 1,000 of them, which I was looking at Twitter today, and I think Chateau posted a link to the auction account on OpenSea, and they're already in there. So they are moving forward with this. And the day is this Sunday, October 3rd. And so they said they'll give away 100, and then they'll sell the remaining 900 to who's ever interested. And it'll be interesting. It says NASCAR branded initiatives, special airdrops, entry to exclusive events, and additional perks. So, I think we've been hearing rumors that ZED may do their own tournaments to go along with some of the community tournaments we've seen. And so maybe for exclusive events, that's what they're talking about. I mentioned skins. Who knows if that's what would be airdropped. I doubt it's going to be horses, but time will tell kind of what this could be. And who knows if they'll release more details before they end up selling these. I thought it was cool that they are releasing a new racetrack. I'm a big fan of the sponsored tracks that they've released in the past.
Yeah, me too. I really like the Stella Artois one, actually.
And the Atari track's pretty cool too. So this one looks pretty freaking dope too. Ebbs looks like he's been working hard on some of these skins and the new track.
The track looks like it's slanted, eh?
Yeah, I think that's just the art. I doubt it's going to be like a
circular track.
Yeah, a circular track or anything like that.
Oval, whatever you want to call it.
We'll see.
It's slanted, confirmed.
Yeah. But I don't know. I mean, again, the announcement was pretty basic, but we really just wanted to call it out as, hey, positive development. It may not be exactly what we want, but CJ, you and I were talking about it earlier. Just because they're working on these partnerships and working on bringing in interesting sponsors to the game and getting more eyeballs and getting more interest from other communities demographics doesn't necessarily mean that they're not working on other things in the background too. I mean, it really would be different teams working on this. They have marketing people. I'm sure they have a team working on opportunities like this that's separate from devs and the technical stuff that they're working on.
Yeah, so, I mean, and this is something that kind of, I think it gets blown out of proportion a lot of the time. In general, I refer to it as general, but a lot of people will complain about something like this being announced. But yeah, exactly, Sean.
Yeah,
There's
Sean.
They have different teams for everything, right? So the team working on Stamina is not the same team that is working on the partnerships, not the same team that's working on marketing. Like, at the end of the day, the more partnerships that ZED brings in, like, the better it is for the entire economy of ZED, because you're going to get sponsorship money, you're going to get, better partnerships that bring exposure other places. So every time they do something like this, even though it's not the announcement that maybe you're necessarily looking for, it's still a positive, right? Like, companies like NASCAR and Stella Artois and like these venture capitalists would not be investing in ZED if they didn't see a lot of potential there. So that should give you hope and optimism. Obviously, we're all waiting for the Stamina changes. I can't stress enough how tedious it is to race right now, but that's going to come hopefully this week, I think is what they said. They've still got some time. I've already lost a bet saying I bet that it was going to be done earlier in the week and I lost, but I'm still pretty optimistic, and something like this just makes me more optimistic about Zed because, again, the more exposure, the better for the game.
Yeah. DNA Racing, you mentioned NASCAR has yet to post anything on their Twitter. It's not super surprising. I mean, so if you guys remember when the Stella partnership was announced, Stella actually has a digital marketing team, and they're involved in the head of that team is pretty heavily involved in crypto and NFTs and kind of digital advertising. Other companies, aren't nearly as forward thinking as some other companies. So just because NASCAR isn't, kind of actively pushing and, reacting as quickly as some of these other groups have, I wouldn't take that to be a negative. I think I think they'll get there. NASCAR is a kind of a big established group that sometimes moves a little bit more slowly than others. So, that's kind of how I interpret that, but I wouldn't worry too much about that. I don't know, CJ, did you want to cover anything else here? I mean, again, there's not a lot in the announcement, but I think, generally we think it's positive. Sean, I'm glad you're here. It sounds like you agree. That's great. Overall,
I'm just pumped that Ray Del Mundo won a race, to be honest.
There you go. Making back some of those $50 losses, right?
Yeah, not quite, but we're getting there.
Yeah. So moving on, I think, we wanted to hit on some of the racing stats. Sean, that's a good point.
I was just going to say, this was something that David worked on and dropped at like 4 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning on Thursday. But it's pretty cool because you get to look at like, how many races are being run, and like especially the split between the types of races is really nice.
Yeah.
Because I think anecdotally we were all kind of like, wow, it seems like there's more $2.50 races being generated now, and we had talked about that for weeks, right? Because they had said that they were going to start pumping out more $2.50 races, but we weren't seeing it, right? And one of the biggest issues that with Zed right now is their race generation algorithm, I guess you would call it.
Yeah.
The races just don't, like, people want to race, but there just isn't enough races. And then
I was surprised though, because we we'll sit there and look at racing for an hour or two at a time, and we're like, why are there no low buy-in races, right? But we'll walk through this. There are some interesting things that have kind of popped out. Before we jump into the charts and talk a little bit about all the different slicing and dicing that I did. Sean, I agree on the engineering hire that they made. He's not necessarily coming from a crypto or NFT space, but see, do you know if looks like we might be down? Okay, it looks like
I think we're okay.
It was spinning on my end. Sorry about that if we dropped out there for a second, guys. The engineering hire that they made, the head of engineering, we thought that was a pretty positive hire. Again, he's not kind of super focused on the crypto space, but he's really involved with gaming and growing big gaming companies. So definitely an interesting hire there. So yeah, I mean, and they haven't been communicating with us as much recently as they were in the last couple of months, but they've continued to build out their dev team. They've continued to add people to the team, and so that's positive too. But jumping into some of the racing, so you guys saw some of these charts a week or two ago. We talked about being at around 1,500 races and then shifting up to 3,000 when they cut it down to 30 seconds. And then end of August, we had the crash. And then after they implemented fatigue, you saw, a general kind of downtrend in racing. But, the last week or so, last week to 10 days, we've really seen an uptick in races, which is good. And we're getting back to kind of that 2,500, 22 to 2,500 race a day level, which is good. And hopefully we'll continue the momentum toward 3,000. And with stamina, I think that can only help. So the sooner that gets released, the more people are racing, the better that is. And then, the free races, which I don't think we had, I think this was 2 weeks ago. You can see that when they announced the free races on the 10th, we popped up to 800 free races a day. And we've definitely seen those free races coming into the system and a lot of people running them. So, I think that this is just kind of a zoomed in view of after Fatigue was originally released, kind of showing the trend. Again, you see the downtrend here, and then it starts to come up again. So
the downtrend, that was when the network was down, though, right? Like that was the.
Well, this was after that. So
yeah, okay.
When we were kind of when Fatigue hit hard and people really stopped racing, you did see that in the system, right?
Yeah.
You went from like 2,500 a couple of days after Fatigue was originally implemented here, down to almost 1,500 races a day. So, a 40% drop. But since then, we really have seen a nice little uptrend.
Mm-hmm.
Since
is that this last one here that coincides with the I think the last 2 days coincides with the release of, it seems like, a higher generation of the $2.50 races.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. So do we want to jump into fee kind of buy-ins by fee?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Because I think that'll show where the 250s really start spiking, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's really evident the last few days. So, zooming in, and this one's a little smaller. Sorry, guys. So a little busier too. So this is all races by fee since January. And the reason that I started it in January was because some of the races between December and January were a little screwy. There were a lot of free races being run. I think they did change the fee system or the rake system in January. And so what I did was I just kind of normalized all of these for the current structure. And so yeah, to your point, CJ, the 250 races, the last 2 or 3 days, you see a huge uptick. Still not reaching the levels that we were at when we were at 30-second queue times. We were almost at 2,000 to $2.50 races a day around that time. But you do see a big spike above, the kind of 1,300 to 1,400 level a day the last 2 days. And, fortunately or unfortunately, that does coincide with, a general downtrend in some of the higher buy, and even $5 have taken a nosedive. And what I don't know is if they've cut back on the $5 generation, or if people are really just choosing the 250 races over that.
I feel like there are less $5 races. I'm wondering if, like, in some way the algorithm kind of takes into account how many existing races there are at a certain distance when it generates. And I feel like if you're having a higher number of $2.50 races, that naturally leaves less room for a $5 or a $10 if you already have like a $15 or $20 one.
Yep.
That's just speculation on my part. I haven't actually looked into whether that's the case, but I do remember a while back there was a stuck 2,000. It was like a stuck 2,200 or 2,400 that was there for like a few days, and I feel like I didn't see. I didn't see any like 2,200 to 2,400s generate while it was stuck.
Buy-in.
Yeah. So I feel like that there's some kind of correlation there, but I could be wrong.
Yep.
So maybe with the increase in generation of $2.50 races, you're going to see less $5 and less $20 and so on, or $15, as long as there's like a higher buy-in one that's sitting there.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, just looking at, again, the same chart as I showed before, since fatigue was implemented August 23rd, you really see that trend bearing out here of, the last 3 days. There have been almost 400, 2 days ago, there were almost 400 more $2.50 races than, the average of the kind of month before it. And you do see a little bit of a trend down in $5 overall, a little bit of a trend down in $10 as well. And then, the one thing that I wanted to call out that I'm not super bullish on this, because I think the higher buy-in races are good for the ecosystem. I think they're, good for kind of driving the value of racers. And what I did want to show was, specifically trimmed down to 10, 15, 25, and 500 and 50. 50s have been pretty flat. 25s, there haven't ever really been more than 50 run a day, but you do see a pretty negative trend in the $10 and $15 races since the implementation of fatigue and since the one race at a time limit rolled out.
So I think something that would drive, I was just going to say, so I think something that could drive something like that is that with the way that stamina is currently implemented, and I think we'll see a change once the fix is actually released. It doesn't really make a lot of sense for a lot of the horses that can only compete in maybe one $10 or $15 race a day, because they have to be at 100% stamina for them to be confident enough to go into those races. So what they'll do is just do one 10 or 15, and then they'll just continuously drop the buy-in as they gain more fatigue. I mean, I do that anyway, but it logically it makes sense.
No, that's right. Yeah. People, instead of running, 10 or 15, $25 races a day, they're kind of picking their spots. They race one or two $10 or $15 races and then immediately drop into some of those lower buy-ins where they know they'll be more competitive. I 100% agree. And the hope
unless you're me with Ray and you just throw them into $50 races all day and lose.
Exactly. You're supporting the green line at the bottom, CJ.
That's right. Somebody's got to support
it. News. Yeah. But hopefully with the stamina, rolling out, we'll start to see these start to trend back up. People will take advantage of being able to run, 5 to 8 races a day, or every 12 hours without that fatigue really kicking in.
Yeah, that's going to be huge, I think, for the ecosystem and the higher buy-ins, especially with not losing stamina for the first 5 to 8 races every 12 hours. So you're looking at 10 to 16 races at 100% stamina a day. I do think the fields will be somewhat tougher just because you're going to have those fully rested horses in most races. But I also think that it's going to push a lot of those horses that are currently kind of clogging up the $5 to $10 buy-ins that would normally be a little more open. They might get pushed up into higher buy-ins too, because there's not that there's less risk involved, but they're going to be more confident because they're going to be running at full strength the whole time. I know for sure with me, I'm running some horses for other people that are quite strong, but high variance horses are really hurt a lot by stamina, by fatigue. So running them in high buy-ins just doesn't make a lot of sense when they lose so much strength every time they race.
Yep. And Donkey Kong, that's a good observation. Actually, I didn't think about that, CJ. I don't know if you thought about that, but maybe the uptick in the 250s is really related to some of the. I don't think this general downtrend is related to that, but some of the stronger racers have focused on the 250 races for the zombie tournament and for other tournaments, and so maybe that is part of the reason for some of that change. But
I definitely think that there's an element of that for sure. There is. Do I think that there's enough people to really drive the stats this much? Probably not. Yeah, exactly. I do think it's one factor. I think it's probably like a smaller factor than fatigue itself, and
it probably explains a couple hundred of those incremental races, but it doesn't necessarily explain the general trends that we've seen over the last couple of weeks. So,
yeah, exactly.
I'm not gonna focus on it too much, but I did want to show. We broke this down by class 3 through 5 and classes 1 and 2 as well. And so really the trends are very similar. In fact, this 3 through 5, looks a lot like the overall chart. Same thing with the 250s way up and some of the other higher buy-ins kind of trending down, even more so in the lower classes than overall. So
a good question there by House of Ice and Fire, if you wanted to pull that up. And a good kind of point by Velo Racing as well. Yeah, absolutely. And how do I think it's going to affect things is that I think a lot of horses right now are really benefiting from fatigue in order to downclass. And I think what you're going to end up seeing is a lot of that kind of natural hierarchy will be restored, because some horses, if they're at 100% stamina, just will not lose nearly as easily as they will when they're, say, like 20 or 30% fatigued, right? So I think right now it could be driving some of the horses to be really smashing those $2.50 races to try and downclass as much as possible before the fix is implemented. Yeah. And then once the fix is implemented, I think what you're going to see is something that I do with some of the stronger horses I have is I use $5 buy-ins to downclass. And I think that that's going to have to be a reality for some of these horses, because when you have 250s for downclassing, so many horses are trying to downclass. It's almost like you're fighting for that kind of like last spot. Right. And really there's only a few of those to go around. So the stronger horses will end up needing to use higher buy-ins to downclass. And I mean, realistically, that should be how it works, right? Or they just stay in a higher class.
I almost exclusively use $5 to downclass, unless I have, a weaker racer that I know is kind of on the lower end of the scale.
Yeah. Well, and the thing about $5 too is that, like, logically speaking, at least for me, is that most people who are entering $5 races are trying to win. So you're going to have an easier time losing. Yeah. So Slick, the stamina adjustment that's coming out is just they're changing the regeneration rate to 12 hours instead of 24 hours. And then they're also making it so that you don't start losing stamina until after at least 5 races. So some horses will start losing stamina a little bit later than 5 races. It'll be between 5 and 8, they said, for 99% of horses.
Right. But Slick, that is the fix that we were talking about, the kind of fixing it so that we can race again. So, and then you mentioned, Velo's comment. It could be. I mean, that's, there's a, I think a lot of people have, there are a lot of the better horses that have stopped trying to downclass, but I think overall, yeah, that's right. I mean, it's going to be that much harder unless you have a horse that, for horses with high variance, right? It's going to be that much harder to downclass once the 90% change rolls out. So, but yeah, cheat to win. That's exactly right. So that the stamina system, what it'll be is they'll stretch the front end of the S curve out. So actually, we didn't want to cover fatigue in too much detail, but one thing that I did want to call out is I've seen some questions or comments about kind of random stamina drops or random fatigue increases. One thing that we didn't necessarily cover very well or in depth on our fatigue stream was the S curve that we're talking about. It's already implemented, but you start to work down the S curve immediately right now from race 1. So your first 3 races are at the top of that S. So you go from kind of 100 to 92 or 91 or 89 in your first 3 races, and then you drop call it 5 to 10% with that 4th race, and it increases exponentially as you continue to race down the curve. And so most horses, it takes them 5 to 6 races to get to that 70% level, which is where you're not able to lose points right now. But the other piece of that is the regeneration, regardless of right now versus this change, will still be linear. So right now it's 24 hours you regenerate, and it's rounded to the nearest percent. So you can race once and 20 hours later it could show 100%, but until that race rolls off, until 24 hours passes, that next race is going to count as if you just raced your previous race. So if you race 3 times and you get back to 99 or 100%, but you don't wait the full 24 hours, then that next race will be considered the 4th race on the curve. Or, if you race 5 times or 6 times and get down to 55%, and you're back up at 95 or 98%, that next race, if will take you from 55 down to or whatever that change would have been, let's call it 55 down to 30. Your next race will take you from 98 to 73, right? So it's looking at where you were on the S curve when you ran your last race, if that race was within the last 24 hours, and the change in fatigue will register as if you had just run that previous race. I wanted to make sure to call that out. And in this new system that we're talking about, that they've talked about, and we've hoped was gonna roll out the last couple of weeks, will work the exact same way. The two changes will be, the top of the S will be flat for the first 5 to 8 races. And then instead of 24-hour regeneration, it'll be 12 hours. So as far as we understand, it'll still be linear. It'll still be, looking at the number of races you've run. Once you start to work your way down the S curve within that 12 hours, if you don't wait the full 12, it'll take you, down as if you just ran that last race. So CJ, I don't know if I hope I explained that well enough.
Yeah, I mean, all I would say is just that, like, when it first started happening, people were asking a lot of questions. So I was like looking at it and I was like, oh, why is this happening? And basically just the simple way of looking at it is that, and it's actually in the documentation, is that it's each concurrent race in the 24-hour period. So all you have to do to look at and see like what kind of stamina you're going to be losing is just how many races you've had in the last 24 hours. So it's not. A lot of people will look at like, oh, this is how much stamina I had, and then I lost a whole bunch. But at the end of the day, it's not about where your stamina is at when you race. It's how many races you've had in the last 24 hours. And then, that, like you said, when it changes to the 12-hour splits, it'll be how many races you've had in the 12 hours, not what your stamina is at when you race.
Yeah. So CJ, I don't know about you. I don't race a ton. Looks like we dropped again. I don't know if.
It still seems live to me, but oh yeah, no, it's spinning.
Yeah.
Is your internet fine? Oh, we're back, I think.
So. Yeah, okay, there we go. Sorry guys. I think we're back. So we were talking a little bit about fatigue and the 24 versus the 12 hours. The thing that I was going to say when I think we started spinning was, CJ and I think both look at, either Haku or Know Your Horses, and we kind of look at, we track, the races that we've run, and then we just kind of keep track of that. So, if you're using the Haku webhook, or you're using the Know Your Horses plugin, or whatever else you might be using to track your fatigue, it's just because it says 100% doesn't necessarily mean you're fully regenerated. You really have to keep an eye on, when that first or when that last race was run, and the timing around that. So, but yeah, jumping back into the racing fees, what what I thought was interesting, and what somebody brought up in our Discord earlier today was, we actually have seen, this is class 1 and class 2. We actually have seen a similar uptick in the $2.50 races in class 1 and class 2. So for a while, before the middle of July, there were a few back in April, or March and April. But I should say, sorry, April and May, these are 25s. There were a few $2.50 races here, but what they did was they actually got rid of those because that was kind of the initial step they took to combat downclassing or combat U-shaped horses, before they put the limitation on using higher class races to downclass your horse. They came out in Discord and mentioned, hey, we're only doing $5 and above in class 1 and class 2 because we want to disincentivize people from using those higher class races to downclass. And so here there aren't any 250s, and then you see a big uptick when we had the 30-second queues, and then you had a pretty steady state of around 100 a day in class 1 and class 2, which is what, 3 or 4 an hour. But again, just like with the lower class races and overall trend, you've seen a big uptick in 250s. I think somebody was saying that there were 3 class 1 $2.50 races populating at a time, which was unheard of a couple months ago. So just thought it was interesting to see. And again, that 250 uptick comes with a pretty material drop off in $5 races. So if we're looking at the recent stats, you see that same trend of a huge spike in 250 races and a really sizable, almost 50% decrease in the number of $5 races that are run. So, CJ, any thoughts there? Or I know this might be the first time you're seeing some of these by class charts. So anything stand out to you?
Not really. No, it's like, you're already explaining it pretty well. And again, I think this just all comes down to a huge amount of more $2.50 races that they're pumping into the system right now.
Yeah, which is good. I mean, that it means that
it's what they were talking about for a long time,
right?
Yeah. At least they're doing something. Like, race generation has been one of the biggest issues for a long time. We've touched on that before. They talked about adding more $2.50 races to the ecosystem for a long time, and it looks like, I guess it would have been 2 or 3 days ago that it actually started being implemented. So we're moving forward. Baby steps.
Baby steps, exactly. Just give us stamina. We'll hopefully see some of these $5 and $10 and $15 races start to tick up. And
I see a lot of doom and gloom, but I think that aside from the tedious aspects of racing, ZED is in a really healthy place, and people refer to the market and like stuff like that, how say like glue and the floor is falling out, but people are still buying good horses. It's just that people have stopped buying bad horses, and that was never sustainable, right? Like, it never really made sense that you could breed a horse, race it, have it be terrible, and then you could still sell it for a profit. That shouldn't be how things work.
Right.
And I mean, I said that probably 2 months ago, where I was like, eventually people are going to stop buying horses for way more than, the stud fee, that are just trash. Like, why would someone buy that horse? Like, what are they buying it for? Most of the time, I think what it was when breeding first opened is just that there was such a low supply of horses at the time and such a high demand that people were just looking at whatever the cheapest thing was there and they were buying it. Now, it just means that you have to be a little bit more deliberate in what you're doing. If you're breeding, you're either going to sell it unraced and give someone a lottery ticket. And even those are not going to be super expensive, because 95% of horses that are bred are not good racers.
Yep.
And then the other part of it is just that you maybe just have to start racing your own horses and hoping that you're getting a racer out of it. And that's how I've been from the beginning. So this doesn't affect me at all. Like I've always raced all of my horses, and I sell the ones at the floor if they're bad, or if nobody wants to buy them, then I just send them off to the glue factory or glue stable and forget about them. And the easiest way to mitigate that is just you want to set up it. I think people are just going to have to really take a deeper look at how they want to set up their stables and the most economical way to run their stable. And that means, having in-house studs and knowing what you want to breed like well ahead of time rather than just, throwing random stuff together. And again, despite what some people may think, we've never been proponents of throwing random horses together. There still has to be an element of research and, being deliberate about what you want to breed. You're still going to have to rely on luck to get exactly what you want, but you can still hedge kind of like what you're doing. And I've also always been against paying big premiums for stud fees exactly for this reason. If you go out there, like I remember when breeding first opened and people were putting their studs in for an ETH or 2 ETH for like, Buterins and stuff like that. And it's just like, okay, even Breathless Edge. Let's just say Breathless Edge is in there for 4 ETH. If you pay 4 ETH for Breathless Edge and you get a donkey, how are you recouping any of that? Like you just like, it never really made sense, especially in such an early phase when people didn't understand the breeding process. Right. And like, that's not to say that like anyone has 100% figured it out, but we have a much better idea of how it works now.
Yeah. Just to hit on a couple of these, I have a couple comments there and they kind of line up with some of these questions that are coming in, but Yo-Yo had a question. So yeah, Yo-Yo, we saw the change in the 250s on the 25th or the 26th. I didn't update the data for yesterday's racing, but the uptick really has been in the last 2 or 3 days of these additional $2.50 races. So and then yeah, I generally agree, CJ, with what you're saying about glue. I think that's one reason why we do need some sort of burn mechanic. I mean, we've talked about that a little bit. I don't necessarily want to get into that in detail. I know I shared a few ideas with you, and I want to flesh that out before I kind of announce it publicly. But I think there are a couple of different ways that they could implement something that would let people really kind of burn what they want to burn, and not take horses that shouldn't be burned out of the game unnecessarily. And so I think there's a balance there, but yeah, I do agree. I mean, there needs to be, I think the flip side of that is there need to be horses down around the breeding fees. I mean, that really should be what those kind of entry level horses are worth. I don't think that you should have an entry level racer that can be break even that's 0.04. You're definitely seeing horses that are mediocre to decent racers being sold at that level. But that's more an element of not really being able to run your horses effectively right now because of fatigue, and less because of the long-term prospects of the market. But yeah, the glue horses, the horses that have been run 50 times and haven't won a race or haven't pulled fire in 50 races. Yeah, I generally agree that those shouldn't be worth much. I think legendaries will be worth something, but just because they're so close to Genesis, and not everybody's going to be able to own a Genesis, but you'll be able to kind of pick your spots with legendaries. I think exclusives and below will start to approach those in-house breeding fees, and you're already seeing some of that with some of the floor prices right now. And Snooze, we've mentioned before that we're not. I get why the unraced premium exists. I definitely am supportive of it from a collector's value on the Genesis side and potentially on the legendary side too. But because it does take a lot more effort to discover horses, and because that process costs a little bit of money, we're definitely not surprised to see those unraced prices really, those unraced premiums really go away. Little surprised it's happened in, some of the markets. You saw Zaba Legendary unraced. There are some, I would call them even efficiencies, because the unraced floor is around what the glue raced floor is. But in that instance, you're almost kind of getting a free chance to get a decent racer, because you have the floor price that's kind of supporting the floor race price that's kind of supporting your horse. So I think you can view it, both ways. CJ, did you have any other comments there before? I know you kind of gave your opinions and I built on.
No, sorry. I was just kind of actually looking at some stats, and so Try Guy was asking if 95% of bred horses are not profitable. How does the game continue? And I mean, I don't see why that would stop the game from continuing. It just means that you just have to be a little bit more deliberate in how you're approaching the game, right? A little bit.
And it's not 95% are unprofitable. You might have said that, or you might have heard it, but it's, I mean, in May and June, like 30% of horses were ROI positive. And between the free races and the 250s and kind of the fatigue and how it's affected some of the top racers running, there are a lot more than 5% of horses that are profitable right now, especially with the free races, and if people are getting in those and racing effectively. So
right now of horses with 50 or more races, 20% are profitable.
Yeah.
And that's 50 or more races. So you have to think, like, there's a lot of really bad horses that don't make that 50 race mark. So it's much lower than 20% are actually profitable of bred horses. I mean, all horses, I should say.
I mean, I'll flip that on its head, though. There are a lot of horses that run a few races or run, 10 races and are profitable. So the number that I was referring to back in June was horses that have run more than 10 races, like 30%. So I think it's somewhere in that 20 to 30% range. I don't think you see a drop off of, below that 50 race mark of those horses being a lot less profitable. Let's see. Yeah. And Yo-Yo, to your point about the classes. Yeah. I mean, there's obviously debate on expanding the class structure and, tying it back to some of what we're presenting today, what the racing structure looks like. I think there's an argument to be made that there are enough horses in the game now that you could probably expand to 7 or 8 classes and populate those lower classes with, with lower buy-in, $2.50, maybe some $5 races, and have some of the horses that can't necessarily compete, get into those lower classes. I don't think there are enough horses to have 10 classes or more than 10 classes at this point, but long term we could definitely see that.
Well, I think we talked about something that would make sense if the game continues to grow and expand would be to have a dynamic system of classes. Mm-hmm. So basically there wouldn't necessarily be a bottoming out of classes, because in theory, the longer and as long as what we believe the breeding formula continues to be the way it is, you're going to continuously get worse and worse horses over time. So if you want to make a place for all horses to be able to run, you're just going to need a dynamic class system that continues to add classes as more and more horses drop into lower classes, right? So a dynamic system like that might facilitate having a much larger user base. But like you said, right now the issue is well, I mean, I do think that there could be some class expansion right now that would benefit the game, but I just don't think that it's necessarily the biggest problem at the moment. And what we'll see is with stamina fixes and some of the other things that they're rolling out, we'll see some more racing and I think like there's other things that they can add too in the future, right? Besides just classes, it'll be like different types of races.
Yep.
Like Try Guy's saying, like having races with 5% or less win rate, and they've already teased that, right? So
yep.
So we know that there's stuff in the works to make more horses usable. And again, like once stuff, people talk a lot about party mode and all these other things. So there'll be ways for more and more horses to be usable in the future.
Yep. Yeah, and I know Dragnet mentioned it, and Yo-Yo was talking about Z100s. There are horses that are Z20 or higher, higher Zs, Z50s, Z100s that can be competitive. It's just less likely. So that is an argument for some of these, special Z, 0%, 5% races. That is an argument for maybe adding a class or two. CJ, to your point about a dynamic structure, we've kind of said, or I mentioned in my ZED Insights interview that the struggle that we have with Flames, as much as we like them, that it's really hard to rank horses head to head. There needs to be some sort of ranking system. That's what odds did. It lets you kind of look comparatively between horses in races. But if in my mind, as soon as you said dynamic system, if they roll out ELO and that's a ranking system, you kind of move the classes around based on those ELO rankings, right? And so you kind of have, instead of the class rating system that we have now, where you're moving up and down, you have ELO ratings kind of driving that. And, because they can backfill the ELO ratings based on all of the head-to-head data that they have, all the racing data that they have. And then you have classes or divisions based on those ELOs and based on number of races run, stuff like that. I think would be a pretty straightforward way of reforming the class system and getting some of these horses into races where they can be more competitive. The flip side of that, you have to have horses that don't make money or aren't competitive in some of the races that they're running, right? So, but yeah, so I think we've talked on that. Let me flip through this spreadsheet a little bit more. We talked about the fees. One thing that I wanted to, and this is super, super busy, but one thing that I thought was really interesting was looking at the race percentage by distance. And so you can see the overall number of races. You have the same general uptrend that we've been looking at. The one interesting thing is over the last few days, you've seen a lot more 1,000 and 1,200 races coming into the system, and a big uptick. Again, you guys probably can't see, but the orange and gray lines here are orange is 1,000 and gray is 1,200. So you've seen a huge uptick in the last few days of more sprint distances, which makes sense because for a while, a lot of those shorter distance races were a much lower percentage than some of the middle distance races. And so you can see as we've kind of continued, you have big fluctuations in the number of races that are generated. And now we're really hitting, between 10 and 15% of all races, except for 2,600, between 10 and 15% of all races are spread relatively evenly between 1,000 and 2,400, which again is something that we've talked about with race generation and kind of what they need to fix is, we're not all out there wanting to run 1,600s and 2,200s or 2,000 2,200s, which were the ones that always seem to be getting hung up. It's nice to see that there is a nice influx of 1,000, 1,200, and 1,400 meter races, some of the shorter distances, while some of those longer distances are also being generated. So any comments there? I mean, I think just recently you can kind of see, again, blue here is 1,000, orange is 1,200. So, for for the first time ever, 1,000 meter races are above 14% of the total races generated. And the rest of them have kind of ticked down, but they're all above 10% again, other than 2,600. So, any comments or questions there, CJ?
Sorry, I had my mic on because my dog was barking, but no, it's all good.
Okay. And then the last thing that I wanted to cover was just this kind of the summary of that data. And so overall, you can still see that 1600s are across, class 1 and class 5, the largest, but they're also kind of in the top 3 or 4 of all races generated across the classes. And you have a lot fewer 1,000 meter races in some of the higher classes. And you're kind of biased toward some of the middle distances. So just, kind of calling out some of the stuff that we'd seen with races before, and, some of the complaints that we've seen about, 2,000 and 2,200 getting hung up, or way too many of these races being generated. I think we're seeing more of an even distribution, and other than kind of 1,000 in the higher classes, and 24 and 2,600 overall, you have a pretty even distribution, except in some weird spots. My favorite, though, is still that we've never had a 2,600 meter race run in class 4 ever, generated or run. And then the one weird one that I saw, which I don't really have an explanation for, is 1,800 in class 3. There just aren't a lot of them. So if you have an 1,800 specialist, you better get used to running in class 2 or class 4, or hoping that they start to generate more of these 1,800 class 3 races. But yeah, so I think that that was a lot of the data that we wanted to present today, just kind of going through the fees and going through the distances and taking a look at that. And more importantly, just talking about, we have seen some positive development in racing recently, even with the fatigue system in place. Try guide, it could be, well, let me double check my math real quick. I think this chart here is only paid races. This chart here, I believe, is also only paid races. Maybe not. No, I think that's overall. So never mind. Forget I said that. But the overall chart that I was showing with the percentages here was only paid races. So, hey, Darkside, what's going on, man? Yeah, Bexel. I mean, I know CJ mentioned it in chat, but with the single race lockup where you can't enter more than one race at a time, they really need to keep working on this race generation. It is a positive development that we've seen more races, more 250s, but hoping that things continue to even out over time. And like CJ said, having 250s available, pretty consistently, or even $5 as well, being available pretty consistently would really help. And then Bexel, we're a fan of queues for free races, but I think there's a pretty healthy debate there of queuing up for paid races and what that looks like. Maybe segmenting a portion of the races. I think we talked about this a little bit last week. Maybe segmenting a portion of the races for 250s and 5s would make sense. But
I think having queues for 250 races would be fine. I don't think that, like, especially when racing is really firing and people are actually buying in, 250s aren't up long enough, or the competition is not deep enough at 250 where race selection is really something that you need to worry about anyway. If you're running into a 250, it's kind of like you either think you have a strong horse at 250 or you don't, or you're trying to down class anyway, right?
I think it depends on the class. I get that argument for class 5 where you're just trying to get into races and run your lower class horses. But I do think there are still horses that we see in class 4 and class 3 that run 250s on purpose. And so
who are they avoiding in other 250 races though? Like I just don't see that there's a deep level of competition for 250s where they have to like really sit and pick their spots and really have the time.
There are definitely 250 races that I avoid because there are big racers that solely run 250s on purpose. So I'm not going to name names, but it definitely happens. You don't see him, to your point, you don't see him in class 5 as much. You probably don't see him in class 4 quite as much, but class 3 and class 4, you definitely have some people running really good horses that shouldn't be running 250s that are in those races. So let's see. Crump stain. That's another idea that we've kind of talked about. If you have, just because of how distance preference works, if you have the sprints grouped, if you have 1,000 and 1,200 grouped, if you have 2,200 and 2,400 grouped, or 22 through 26, and then you have some sort of breakdown in the middle, that could work too. So it'll be dark side. No, again, I'm not. You didn't have to fess up. I wasn't talking about you because I haven't seen Darth Talon too much in the races I'm looking at. But
something that we've kind of talked about too with tournaments, and especially in the way that they're run right now, is creating a kind of like multiplier that rewards people for going into higher buy-ins during the tournament, because right now there's no incentive to go into a higher buy-in with the way it's set up. So if you were to say give like a 1.25 multiplier to points to $5 races versus $2.50 races and so on, that'll give people more incentive to race out of the 250 category during tournaments. I don't think it's prevalent. Again, my opinion is that you could easily have a queue for $2.50 races, and it wouldn't make a massive difference in the way that they're run. Or a queue and an open one.
Both. That's right. So CJ, do you want to shift? I think I've talked through the data. We talked a little bit about NASCAR. We talked a little bit about fatigue, which we weren't planning to, but I thought it was important. Mm-hmm. We've talked about some of the racing data that we really wanted to focus on today. And so I think now's kind of a perfect time to jump into some of the summarizing kind of what we talked about and turning that into looking at racers and how we evaluate racers, or I should say how you evaluate racers more so than I do. So how do you want to do that? I'm gonna hide my screen.
How do I want to do that? I think mostly we could just go over like the basic concepts that we have. Is just that, like, so if you look at base ability as like, say, the flat strength of your horse on a scale or spectrum within the class. We look at it as within the class hierarchy, because there's so much noise involved that logically it makes sense that most horses will fall into that hierarchy of class, like where higher base ability will put you in a higher class. And then variance and distance preference are just modifiers to base ability, which either make your horse stronger or weaker depending on what side of the spectrum you're on. So if you're a sprint specialist, your distance preference will be, say, or we believe it's like a flat additive to your base ability on the sprint side, but then it's like a negative to your base ability on the long distance side, and vice versa. As far as variance goes, it's just like a range of performance. You can either outperform your base ability by a certain amount or underperform it by a certain amount, usually equally distributed. At least it makes sense that's how it works.
It's almost like a percentage. It's almost like a percentage multiplier on your base ability, right? It can either extend your base ability above or below the range, or it can shrink So
Mhm.
you have a tighter range
I
of
think
performance, right?
maybe what I'll do is if I pull up a screen, hold on 1 second, because I do actually have like a little visual on my Twitter profile that kind of shows the way, at least that variance, or at least the way that I think variance works. Let me pull this up quickly. Share my screen. Yeah, take it easy.
Yeah, DNA. Appreciate it, man.
Where is it here? Okay. So if you look at this, this is just kind of a way to visualize how variance works. I don't know if everybody's seen it or not. It's just a quick overview. So if you assume that variance is like equally applied, and if you're looking at, say, the typical horse in whatever class that you're in is the black line in terms of their performance, then this is kind of what it would look like, and why really high variance horses look the way that they do. Vanilla Bean is a great example. When he's in his class where his base ability kind of, or she's in her class where her base ability kind of falls in the middle, which I think is somewhere in class 4, I believe. You get like that perfect U shape, right? Because the variance stretches her performance off both sides enough where she either finishes in first or last more often than any other position. And then it's the same. So like if your base ability is super high and you have high variance, well, you're going to win a lot more if your base ability is high relative to what you're racing against. And at the same point, you can use Vanilla Bean in class 1 to look at, what it looks like when you have a really high variance horse with lower base ability than most of the horses they're racing, and performance from those horses, because she loses a lot more than she wins there. So that's just kind of how variance works. And then we kind of went over this last week with distance preference, where we believe it's basically a flat additive value or negative value to your base ability. And then the race simulation actually rolls in a second layer of variance depending on how far away, or sorry, not depending on how far away. The second layer of variance is like a global application to every horse in the race. And I think it's kind of like a 90-10 split somewhere in there. We haven't really pinpointed exactly how the split works in terms of positive versus negative, but we know there has to be negative rolls, which is why sometimes you'll see, I don't think it's 85-15. And I think that's because you'll still get, say, 0 rolls or non-negative roll. It is somewhere between 85 and 90 and 15 and 10, I'm pretty sure. But we're looking into actually getting down to the specific number.
We've talked about 70-30 as well, right? But
I think 70-30 would be too high. It wouldn't make sense.
70-30 has, to your point, some sort of zero roll built in, right? There's some sort of break point in there where are you pulling up?
I'm pulling up LBJ Go because if you look at specifically 2400, this is kind of where you'll see how oh wait, no, not 2400, sorry, 1000. So you can kind of see he's got about a 15% win rate. So the reason why I would say that it's probably less than 15 is because at its very, very lowest, he's going to win every time. But he can probably still win if it's like a -10 roll rather than a -15, if that makes sense. So like on the spectrum of negative, every other horse in the race is going to get weaker, and LBJ Goat is going to get stronger. So there's going to be a spectrum of, he starts to get so strong that he's stronger than all the other horses in the race because they're getting weaker while he's getting stronger. And I think that that's probably before the very lowest possible roll, right? So I think that there's probably a spectrum. I think maybe it's like a 90-10, so like, or maybe like a 0.9 to -0.1 kind of thing.
I mean, this is a perfect example. It has to be higher than 90-10, because if you only have 10% negative, he's not going to be winning 15% of his races. So my point is that the 70-30 is encompassing both kind of 0 rolls in the middle of
sorry, I wasn't,
and 30% negative rolls, which gets you to your top 3, top 4 finishes. So
right. So I was saying more of like on the spectrum of how it affects rather than how often it happens.
sure, that's fair.
But either way, the main point for the takeaway is that it's definitely a very it's like it's definitely weighted more towards the positive side when you're talking about a distance preference role.
Yep.
We see that
Absolutely.
in the consistency in which distance preference horses run at their favored distances. And we also know that it seems to be exponential in terms of how much stronger they get as they move away from 1600.
Yep.
Because 1600, 1400, and 1800 are almost equal. And
Yep.
then once you move to 1200 and 2000, it starts moving a bit higher. 1000 and 2200 are both really high, but 2400 and 2600 basically fall off a cliff. It's like, it's insane how much more consistent long distance. And this is to say, like, you want the most consistent horses. And the reason why you see stuff like LBJ Go, Princess of Power, Mula Mula, those are the best horses or most profitable horses in the game, because 2400 and 2600, the distance preference there is just so much higher than anywhere else.
Their distance preference there trumps everybody else that might have very strong base ability or high variance or whatever it may be.
And since you get such a consistent positive roll there, they just win consistently, right? And if you have a really strong distance preference horse, and that's why 2400 racers right now are probably the most sought after horses in the ecosystem, it's because they're the most consistent winners, right?
Right.
So now all of that to say is that
how do we take that and how do we want to roll that into kind of evaluating racers? Do we want to look at some good horses and then use them as kind of comparison points?
Yeah. So what I can do is I can pull up a horse that we recently got, and I'll just kind of. So now this is maybe not a great example for the current non-odds ecosystem or oddsless ecosystem, but basically this horse came onto the market, and when it came onto the market, it has some odds data, right? So you're able to go through and I think the reason why it's still okay to use this to kind of give an idea of how horse evaluation is important and how you can kind of identify good racers is that I think one of the biggest things to know when you're trying to evaluate a good racer at any point, like especially early on in their racing career, you might call it, is you have to know who the other good horses are that run in your class and run at your distance. So, and that goes across different buy-ins, right? So you can ignore even the odds here, but if you were to go into, say, one of these races, and what was one of the good ones? So you can see like there's a lot of like low buy-ins, but even in low buy-ins, sometimes you can find those really strong horses. So this is a distance horse, and this is like a low buy-in, but let's see. I know that there's some good ones. Just have to find them. But basically what I do is I'll go through all of the races where they've won or where they've lost, and then just kind of compare what the so like Hatsu coming through is really strong, and you can see here you got pretty close odds. Who else? Dreamy Bell is super strong, against the spread is strong. So you can see just by like kind of like going through, and what it does is kind of like draws on your knowledge of the racing hierarchy, I guess, where you can kind of see what, like, if you know what the good racers are and the benchmarks for what you're racing against, it makes it easier for you to identify how strong your horse is. And that can happen in low buy-ins, but like usually in higher buy-ins, you can get a good idea really quickly. And that's not to say that you have to be better than, say, LBJ Goat or, you know, all of the best horses. Like, you don't have to beat the Crimson Chin or have better odds than the Crimson Chin. There's a huge spectrum of horses that are extremely profitable and extremely strong in each different class. So, you know, when you are able to beat them or get fire over them, you know, fatigue has kind of made that a little bit more difficult to evaluate in the current environment. But still, like general things to look for, just if you're going into like a $5 or a $10 race and you get fire instead of a horse that's really strong or profitable, that can be a good sign that your horse is strong. Now, you also have to understand how fire works in order for that to benefit you, because one, how fatigued is this horse that you're running against? We know that fatigue takes away from base ability and the top end of variance. So if they're very fatigued and you're pulling fire, it doesn't mean necessarily as much as if they're at 100% stamina, right? And the other thing too is that high variance horses typically will pull fire less often against horses that have
high distance preference races, right?
Yes, exactly. And even at 1600, right? If you're against a horse that just has high base ability,
right,
we just have to remember that fire really indicates 1, 2, 3, right? Like top 3% or top 3 chance, rather than odds, variance, which represented who was going to win, who had the best chance of winning and losing, really. But
and variance is pushing you to the ends, right? So variance, you can have a higher chance of winning, but a much lower chance of 2 through 3 or 2 and 3. And so the point that you're making, and I think we've made before, is that a higher variance horse can still be strong and can still win a lot of races, but that's where you have to start looking at placement patterns at certain distances, right?
Yeah.
So you can't always depend on fire or flames to dictate whether you're stronger than certain horses in a race.
Yeah, but now all that to say, fire is a really good indication, right, of how strong you are. And the other thing too is it's also something I think that they have a really clean look on Haku for showing these things. But it one thing that fire really does is it really tells you where your distance preference lies with your horse. And you'll have profiles like this where it's clearly a sprint profile. Most spikers will have like 100% at 1,000, 100% at 1,200, and then they'll start going down at 1,400. High variance sprint profiles look more like this with Discord, where you can still get some fire at 1,600 and even 1,800, but your fire goes down at 1,000 because spikers will draw fire over you, even if you have a good chance of winning, right? Like unless you're like super strong, something like a Mirajo or Mirajo and Ray Del Mundo, where they're just like so strong that they'll still pull fire 99% of races at 1,000 anyway, even though they're not spikers. And then then you have your flat horses that are more like 16 to 18. That's like a Vanilla Bean. Actually, I haven't actually looked at her fire profile, but I would assume
she's got a little bit of distance preference. But
yeah, she's got a bit, but it's a lot more flat, right? So but again, she's like a fairly strong, like really high variance horse. So she usually has a pretty good chance of winning and finishing in the top 3. And then of course,
it might take a few days for us to get it up on YouTube, but the video will be available on Twitch.
Yes, from Out of the Trees, a good example.
And then we'll move it over. So appreciate you jumping on tonight. But yeah, that goes for everybody. If you join late and miss some of this, or you want to go back and rewatch it, we'll have I think we just dropped our signal again.
What is going on? All right, we're back.
All right. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, we'll have it up on YouTube. But again, sorry, this is an example of a more flat profile that's a little bit better than Vanilla Bean, because it can kind of show you most flat horses that have this are best run somewhere in the 14 to 18 spectrum, depending on if they have any kind of slight distance preference. And again, that's just goes to show that 1,400 and 1,800, the distance preference, the way it affects those distances is much smaller. So flat horses with, I don't know why I call them flat horses, but the ones with less distance preference will have a better chance running.
Well, they generally tend to be flatter odds, right? In the old odds look, and that is what I wanted to go back and reiterate is, you mentioned you don't have to look at odds I think odds are still very important to look at for the horses that we have them. And I think that's another reason for we need a replacement for odds, because again, right now, if you're just looking at a new horse and you're looking at how they stack up, you can certainly look at placements, but especially your high variance horses, you're kind of going to be all over the place depending on what the roles are, right? You're going to tend toward first and 12th, but it's going to take you a higher volume of races to do that, to see that. We've talked a little bit about an ELO system or something to rank horses head to head, trying to see. And again, that ELO won't necessarily help from race to race, like individual races, like odds did. But at least over time, over the course of 10 or 20 races, you'll be able to compare that, those kind of general rankings of your horse and how that looks over a sample of races, and be able to kind of start to benchmark your horse a little bit better. So I think that's important. And again, that's one way that we can still take advantage of the odds data that's available is looking at those horses that have, competed against horses that we know, and taking it a step back further. All of this is just to say that, doing your research and really digging into the race history, before you buy horses is really important here. We're not, what we're trying to do is in the last 20 minutes kind of go through what our stream last week was all about, what we covered over the course of the entire stream, trying to take that and say, look, these are the different things that we're looking at when we look at horses, and help you guys evaluate racers. But in the end, it's all about, taking kind of some of the stuff that we're talking about. And, again, we're not big speed guys, but there are definitely proponents of speed out there. There are definitely, components of speed that you can look at with horses that have run a large sample of races. And there are definitely other factors that people look at that can help you evaluate racers. And the important thing is kind of taking this information and figuring out, the strategy that you want to use. And so right now we're just trying to kind of walk through certain racers and kind of show you how we think about it with hands-on examples versus what we did last week, which was talk more about the mechanics and how we think things work. This is kind of more practical application of that. So I feel like I'm actually a teacher. Not that I'm doing as much talking as you are this week, CJ, but I feel like we're sitting here, we're teaching now versus just theorizing like we were last week. So
yeah, well, I mean, I think it's important that, I think with a lot of the stuff that we try to do is just like identify how things work, and that gives people kind of like the tools that they need to use. But I still think that like being able to explain how we use the tools that we have and the knowledge that we have and apply that to finding racers, to finding horses that we want to breed with, and all that other stuff is still important. It goes with the old adage of, teach it, or give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, and again, this is all just like our view on how things work. We're not affiliated with ZED. We don't know the inner workings of how everything works. This is just kind of like the stuff that we've derived from statistics and experience, and kind of just trying to put it all together to give people the best chance possible that we, or at least what we believe to be the best chance possible of improving their experience with ZED. So identifying high base ability is something that we've gone over a few times on different streams. I don't know if you have the link to our YouTube. We went over our theory on how that works with BG. But basically, we like to look at average class as a starting point, and then within the highest class possible, if you're looking at like left leaning results and trying to eliminate the variance, usually 14 to 18. So 14, 16, 18 are the best distances to kind of use to get a good idea of how strong the horse is relative to the fields that they're running, because it doesn't have as much distance preference kind of clouding what you can see with their base ability. If you want to kind of delve into that a little bit more, feel free to shoot us a DM or join the Discord. We have a really good crew there that takes their time to help people out all the time. We're very open to everyone, and we try to help everybody out that we can. I think after our Discord opened, I spent like 3 days doing nothing but evaluating horses and helping people try to find stuff. So, and as far as, is that Farce of Will? Yeah, Farce of Will. I don't like
one thing before you jump into that, because I think we both have pretty strong opinions there. So I think one thing that CJ didn't mention is high base ability doesn't necessarily make you a good racer on its own. And so the reason that we're focusing more on distance preference and variance today, and when we're talking about racers, we're generally focusing on those, is because it's easier to see those stats and how, or those qualities and how they affect racing. Like we've talked about variance, having U-shaped placement patterns, and if you are a speed person, they'll have flatter speed curves at certain distances over a large sample of races. Distance preference will show up short or long. And so, base ability, to CJ's point, is you can find good racers with higher base ability at that 1400 to 1800 distance profile. And you're looking more for horses that have finished in the top 6. The simplest way to think about it is finishing in the top 6 more than you finish in the bottom 6. And generally, again, having variance doesn't mean you have low base ability, and there's no correlation between the two. But that's we kind of separate base ability, especially when it comes to racing. We don't necessarily focus on it as much. So,
well, even if you look at kind of what I was using to show, so I'll just do this again really quickly. This, right? Like even just looking at this can kind of give you a good idea of kind of how to measure base ability in a horse, right? Because if you assume that most racing is done on a equal distribution of placements within their variance, having a higher base ability, even if you say ignore these lines, if your horse has no variance but their base ability is high relative to the field that they're running in, they're still going to finish on this side of the placement pattern more often than not, because you have an equal distribution of most horses, which means that they're often going to run slower than this, and they're going to run down here, right? So we really believe that one of the ways to eliminate variance is just to fold results over on top of each other, which means that if your results are often on the left side of the spectrum without the help of distance preference, then it's likely that your base ability is typically higher than the fields that you're running against. And the reason I say the fields that you're running against is because fields can vary widely depending on, say, your buy-in or your class, right? So just having that left-sided placement pattern is not enough. You have to look at that's why average class is really a good general signal of what you should be looking at. So the higher the average class, the more likely you are to have more races in higher classes. And if you have a lot of races in those middle distances and higher classes, then you can have a better idea of what that horse looks like relative to like higher base ability horses.
But from identifying racers, I'm going to pull up my screen because I think this will show. So this is one of my horses. So if you're just looking at overall placements, relatively U-shaped, right? But, identifying quote unquote base ability, kind of going to what I was saying, if you look at class 3, somewhat flat, a little bit of U with more placements in the bottom half, right? But if you look at class 5, a ton of top 3s, right? So that's not necessarily this guy has a slight short distance preference, but that's across, his a relatively flat odds curve. And so just speaking from a racing standpoint, that is a way, talking about class and how to look at placements, that is a way that you can kind of start to identify. But to CJ's point, average class is important. Seeing how these placement patterns stack up, up and down classes is important. And unfortunately, the only way you can start to see this is if you run a horse 100 times or more, right? Or if you have, 50 to 80 to 100 races in multiple different classes, then you start to see these patterns start to form. You might be able to get away with it at 40 or 50. But even at that, CJ, I know you've had horses that haven't won. They have certain placement patterns at certain distances, but, they haven't won over a 20 to 30 race subsegment of their races.
Yeah, I mean, if you pull my screen back up, actually, I can show with the horse that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So Discord Revolution took him 30 races to win at 1400.
Right.
Now he has 100 races and he's got 17 wins. He's, pretty profitable at 1400. He does really well there, but variance is kind of a bitch sometimes, right? So it's like, you can get into those bad streaks. So, and then I just kind of wanted to come back to that comment that Farsight Will was asking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of the Griffin races to evaluate breeding or base ability. I don't like it. I don't. The problem that I have with Griffin races is that they have a lot of great information in them. Mm-hmm. That takes time to delve through. You can get a lot of really good relative and comparative racing ability. Mm-hmm. But the problem with Griffin races and fire is that you can literally pretty much get fire with almost any legendary horse at this point, because there's so many bad horses being bred. And especially if you're looking at, say, 1200 or 1000 or 2200, 2400, distance preference plays such a huge part that you don't really get a lot of information in a vacuum from a Griffin race, because it's so dependent on the relative strength of the field. So if you put a legendary ZED15 in against 11 ZED100 crosses, right? Yeah. It's going to get fire almost no matter what, right?
Yeah.
The likelihood of all of those horses getting enough base ability passed down through all of the breeding process is not good. So you don't even have to have if you breed a Z4 legendary knack, you're probably getting fire in basically any Griffin race that you run, whether it's distance preference or not.
And that's what I was going to say. I think when Flames first came out, Cryptog actually posted the percentages of horses that got Flames in the Griffin. Mm-hmm. And so what you were seeing is, low Z Genesis horses were getting 100% of Flames. Low Z legendaries were getting a very large 80+% of Flames. Mm-hmm. I'll try to see if I can pull up some of the charts just as an example. But I completely agree. I think, taking a step back or reiterating what CJ started with is Griffins are useful. Griffins give you a good bit of information, or can. But as far as just using that single race to evaluate whether that horse was a successful breed with strong base ability, you really can't do that. In order to see base ability, you really have to have a sample of races to look at the placement patterns and understand how the horse is running, what distance preference it has, what variance it has. And so you just can't do that in a Griffin. So, that's basically another way of saying what CJ said is Griffins are very useful, but not for this specifically. Mm-hmm. So.
And just to kind of hammer that home is that I'm pretty sure over the last 2 or 3 months, every legendary that I have bred, whether it was a good racer or a bad racer, got fire in its Griffin race. And I'm pretty sure every exclusive or most exclusives that I've bred that, well, no, a bunch of the exclusives got fire, but those were like Zabos and like had knock blood. But like the high Z numbers didn't get fire, right? And that's not necessarily a product of bad breeding. It's just, you know, what ends up happening is you have a huge element of RNG going down every time that you breed. And so it takes a large element of luck to have a high Z. I flip-flop between Z and Z, a high Z horse being able to continuously get a high pass down of base ability.
Yep.
So all of that to say, I don't think that Griffin races are a good measuring stick for good or bad breeding. It's just too many moving pieces going on.
Yeah.
Lakeview Lad.
While you're pulling that up, I'm gonna pull up this chart. So again, this is off of Cryptog's Twitter, which is just Haku at Haku_com. And so he posted this back in August. It's a little small, so I'm going to try to zoom in if I can. It's not working. So never mind. But basically what it was showing was, I'm going to try to get back to it. You can kind of see. So, Z1, Z2 Genesis, Z3, Z4 Genesis, Z5 Genesis. They're all, Z1 through Z4 are all 100% flames. Z5 is 97%. Z6 is 91%. And then, Z2 legendary, Z3 legendary, Z4 legendary, 90, 97, 95, 87%. So in a vast majority of the races, you're seeing these, low Z horses get flames. And even if you look at, Z8 legendary Zabos, 63%. So again, to CJ's point, if you have a relatively good legendary horse that you're putting into races, they're going to pull flames at a pretty high percentage. Especially a lot of these horses. I think this includes all horses. So looking at the historical data, there were legendaries, there were exclusives that were running against Genesis, a vast majority of Genesis fields and Griffins. So, in that respect, these percentages are probably a little bit low compared to what they would be if you're just looking at Griffins now. So, I know we went a little bit more in depth into that, but I think it's important to talk about that because
and again, like we were saying before, Griffins still give you a lot of good information. My best horse my two best horses that I've ever had for racing that I bought, both were off Griffin evaluations based on basically what you end up doing is it was a lot easier when you had odds, but you kind of go through the races of all the other horses in the race and you find a baseline of how strong they might be relative to the horse that you have in the Griffin race. And then through that, you can kind of extrapolate how strong your horse might be about the competition or might be relative to the competition that they're facing. Now, the problem with that is, and actually this is something that can kind of be related to Lakeview Lad, is that when you have such high distance preference, your odds are naturally going to get pumped up in a Griffin race because you're not going to have a lot of competition. So what you end up with is spikers in those races that have really good odds. But then when they go out into the actual competitive field and they face other stronger spikers, their odds start to spike and you can see that they're not actually that strong. And that's why I was going to say, I took a look at Lakeview Lad. 3.4 odds in a 2,600 Griffey it's really tough because there's no other spiker in that race, or at least no obvious spiker in that race. So you're looking at something that is basically a pure gamble because you have no like relative baseline to go off
where
of.
It's ranked. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, like I don't really pay attention to speed or times, and we're actually going to go into that in a stream soon to come. We have We have some new data that is really interesting about speed. But anyways, that's kind of for another stream.
Yeah.
Yeah, all that to say is that Lakeview Lad, I think, would be a huge gamble. Could be really strong, because obviously at 3.5 odds is always a nice showing. But again, because you don't really have any idea of how it fares against other spikers, you're taking a pretty big gamble on it.
And one other thing, again, we're not big speed guys, but Griffin races tend to be faster than paid races. So if you're just looking at how the Griffin times compare to your 25% or your average time across the population, it's going to give you a skewed perspective. I had a exclusive Nakamoto that ran like in the top 10% of times and won his race. And he was a very, very average class 3 racer. And that's probably being generous. So just because it has a super fast Griffin time, that doesn't necessarily mean that the horse is going to be able to maintain that speed. And, I think that obviously we have pretty strong views on speed. We'll definitely present more of those in the coming weeks. But as far as like single race speed goes, because of the noise, the KYH wrote a good article about the normalization of speed and the noise that they kind of pump into the finishing times. It's really hard to go off of evaluating any horse on a single race basis. Really, any horse with less than 50 races, it's tough to look at speed. In fact, I don't look at speed at all for any horses that have less than 50 races. CJ, I don't know where you
I don't
stand
look at speed at all
now.
ever.
Yeah. So
speed is trash. Don't bring that shit in here. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I don't actually ever look at speed. So.
Do you want to hit
actually,
on...
sorry, that's not 100% true. That's not 100% true. I look at it as like a third tier statistic when I'm evaluating base ability.
Right.
When I look at mean speed at 1600.
Right.
But that's very rare.
Right. Alpha, appreciate the resub, man. Thanks for the 2 months.
Yeah, thanks, Alpha. I appreciate that.
Do you want to talk about this question?
We should.
So my short answer is no.
So what we've talked about this a lot on various streams is that the biggest contributors to racing success, or at least what we believe to be the biggest contributors to racing success, are variance and distance preference.
Not in that order. Distance preference first. Variance.
Yeah, distance preference is king for sure.
Yeah.
But variance, those are the two variables that play the biggest part in racing at the moment. And those are completely randomly assigned at birth. And we know, like, the devs have talked about it. It's in the documentation. It's represented in the statistics. Like, there's no correlation whatsoever between a good breeder and producing good racers. At least there's no evidence of there being correlation, and there shouldn't be, because those are like the attributes that make a really strong racer are, as we said, like randomly assigned at birth. So having a horse that has, 4 out of 5, like I have a horse that has 4 out of 5 raced foals that are competitive racers. 2 of them are quite good racers. But it's just luck at that point in terms of their actual performance. Now you can control where that starting point is for the variance and distance preference to build off of. So if you have higher base ability to start with, you probably need, say, like a lesser dose of distance preference to make them competitively viable. So that always will play a factor, right? But the higher up in the chain of base ability that you go, the harder it is to be competitive, because you're facing, like, if you get your base ability up to a certain point, it seems that it becomes much and much harder to compete in lower levels or lower classes. So because you get stuck higher up and it's harder to lose, and so on and so forth. So it's really one of those kind of like balancing acts where I think because they don't incentivize running up in class 2 and class 1 right now, I think it's almost more desirable to have a horse that sits kind of maybe in the class 3 type base ability and then gets lucky with variance and distance preference.
Yep.
I think that can change in the future. And I do really think that like over time, it really depends on your goal. Like if you really want to have the best racer ever, or you want to be super competitive in class 1 or be able to beat any horse, you're going to want to try and look for the highest possible base ability, which usually comes from Nakamoto's or really strong Zabos. Like, I mean, we've shown it before, but it's a spectrum, obviously. Like there are some Finnies and there are some Buterins, really rare, that could have really high base ability. But yeah, a horse with, yeah, exactly. So basically, sorry, I had to reread the question one more time just to kind of like reel myself back in because I'll ramble. But yeah, there shouldn't be a correlation between really strong racers or good racers consistently and high base ability.
So one, Trinix and Snooze, appreciate the subs, guys, and really appreciate you starting the hype train. But the one thing I wanted to say was the important word here is consistently, right? Just because consistently has to have a number associated with it. And what you see right now is there are a lot of mares specifically that have 3 or 4 good offspring in their first several breeds. CJ talked about a Buterin that he's got that has multiple strong racers, but that consistently has to be over a larger sample, which we're not going to get, for another 12 to 18 months, really. Even having 5 or 6 good racers, a pattern is starting to develop. But to CJ's point, what he said another way is you have to look at you have to look at those offspring and see why they're good racers. If they have a high dose of variance, if they have a medium dose of variance, if they have a high distance preference, and see kind of what that looks like. But I think we both agree that looking at a horse that's had 3 or 4 good kids doesn't necessarily mean that performance is going to continue. And my example of that is always Earthquake, not a legendary mare called Earthquake that had 3 class 2, class 1 competitive horses in her first 3 breeds. And her last 4 breeds are 0% winners. And the couple that were bred when odds were around had 40 plus odds. So that, just an example on the opposite side of how kind of quickly that breeding success can turn around. So that said, I think I am kind of different from CJ in that I do look at offspring, but I look at it from the opposite way of how many offspring have 40 plus odds or 30 plus odds. Because generally, if you have higher base ability and you're having some racing success, you're not going to have horses that have a large number of horses that have really high odds like that. So it's like everything that we present, it's kind of situational dependent. But I think the key is that looking at a small sample of offspring, it's really hard to tell if that makes a breeder a good breeder, right? So 8-. So I guess before we jump into some of the other questions, I think we've kind of covered what we plan to cover tonight. So now we really are opening up to questions. And
there is still one more thing that we were supposed to talk about, and that's kind of an announcement for this weekend. We are going to be having a relatively, I like to think it might be a relatively large stream. We're going to be collaborating with Zombie Boy Joe and Lacey, Glue Racing. and we're going to do kind of like a little hype stream for the tournaments that are coming up and the last opportunities to mint tokens. And we're going to be doing some horse giveaways. So yeah, this weekend, Sunday, time to be determined, but we'll send out a tweet about everything that's going on. And once we get that going, we'll have Joe on, we'll have Lacey on, and we'll be giving away some horses and doing some other fun stuff. So tune in on Sunday. It's going to be, it should be pretty fun. We'll have, we'll have some replays and some focus on some of the tournaments that have already happened, and just generally have a pretty good stream. I planned it that way, Dragnet. Sorry, man. Didn't want you to monopolize the stream talking about me.
And the other sort of announcement is, we're getting close to 2 hours. We don't want to keep everybody here all night. We are going to stick around and answer your questions for a little while, but we likely are going to do a pop-up stream tomorrow, CJ. I guess it's not really a pop-up stream since we're announcing it to everybody that we're doing it, but are you still available to talk a little bit more about racing tomorrow? TBD. Okay. So we'll at least give people a couple hours heads up tomorrow. I almost will certainly be on to answer questions about racing, but we'll at least a short stream. But we'll let everybody know that. But the main announcement, and I appreciate you breaking in to call that out, is we are planning that stream for Sunday. Will likely be afternoon Eastern time. We may kind of target late afternoon, just so we catch the Aussie audience as well. But we have to kind of balance that with Joe being UK based. So we'll make sure we give everybody plenty of heads up there, and tweet that out in multiple locations, and look forward to seeing you guys then. We'll give a few more details as we get a little closer. I know we're only a few days out, but really looking forward to that one. So kind of getting into some of these other questions, before we kind of wrap up for the evening, want to make sure to give you guys a little while to ask some more questions, and really appreciate all the questions you guys have been asking throughout. So base ability come from the bloodline or from the Z number. To some extent, those things are related, right?
I have hold on, I'll just share my screen.
Okay.
So basically, what you can see from this is that there's a strong, really strong correlation between, at least at the Genesis level, between Z number, and I assume that it would be, that it would just completely follow through on a very general level, that the lower the Z number, the higher the base ability. And this kind of tracks with how the horses fall into the hierarchy.
This is if average class equates to base ability, right? Which we have some internal debate on how closely it tracks, but the key point, I want to make sure we're telling them that we're showing this chart as average class, but there's some evidence that it's relatively correlated, right? And relatively,
I mean, and logically it tracks, right? The best horses or the strongest horses should typically end up going up in class, and the weaker horses down in class, and so on. You'll see little bumps at Z5 and Z10 because they start in lower classes, but you can see it's fairly linear. I don't think that would change very much. If you accounted for that, it would still be probably a linear progression from Z1 down to Z10 in general. But one thing about the box and whisker graph is that you can see that there is still a spectrum, right? The strongest Z10 is still kind of comparable potentially to a class 2 or class 1 horse, right? So that's not to say that it's impossible to have a high base ability Z10 or Z9, but typically speaking, if you don't have any other information to go on, the lower the Z number, the more likely their base ability is to be higher. And that goes through all breeds, because you're still going to have a higher chance of passing down higher base ability from lower Zs in general.
And this is only Genesis horses, but there's some
No.
evidence that. What's that?
Oh, I was just looking at what 8- said.
Yeah.
On average, a Z6 Sabo exclusive would have a higher base ability than a Z8 Beater or Genesis. So I would have to do the calculations for that. But one thing to remember about breeding is that every time you breed, there's a 0 to 10% chance. Well, we don't know, like obviously we can't know the exact numbers, but based on the data that we have and the data that BG has provided, there's a 0 to 10% chance of dropping from the average base ability of the parents. So in theory, if you hit drops each time that you bred, you could end up being weaker, right?
Mm-hmm. But if you have 0% or 1% or 3% drop, then it could be stronger.
Absolutely, you could
Everything's
still
on
be
a range,
stronger,
right?
And of course, that comes with the caveat that it always is very dependent on the specific horse that you're talking about. Some Z8s are stronger than other Z8s. So while you can use this as kind of like a general ranking system, it still is important that you take the time to really individually evaluate each of the horses that you're looking at. Dave isn't wearing a hat. Are you drunk?
It's the morning. I'd be aggressive. So yeah, 8-. I hope that kind of answers it. I think, everything that we're presenting is on a scale. So like CJ was saying, if you're looking at, the top, the middle 25% or the second quartile of Z5s, for example, they're still touching the third 25% of the third quartile of Z4s. And again, part of that is because of the starting class. But if you look at sort of the tail above it, you're still getting, and especially, Z6s are a good example. You're still getting average classes that are competitive with some of those top horses, some of the Nakas and Zabos. And the other part of that question was on bloodlines. Well, bloodlines are correlated with Z numbers, right? So, generally, if you're putting a bunch of Nakamotos together, you're going to have lower Z combinations. If you're putting a bunch of Buterins together, you're going to start to get into the 30s and above pretty quickly. And one
thing I wanted to touch on is that, and this is why when newer players come into the game and they don't necessarily have the budget to buy Genesis horses, I do recommend looking for legendary horses that have been bred with either Nakamotos or Zabos, because a lot of the time what you'll end up having is, say, a lower Z Buterin or Finny legendary that could have a higher base ability than its Genesis equivalent, right? Because it's been bred up in the chain rather than down. And that's really a good starting point for a lot of new players, is to build out their stable with legendaries that could potentially have high base ability, because then they can start breeding stronger horses, breeding back into stronger Genesis, breeding back into stronger legendaries, and still being able to pass down a high amount of base ability without having to necessarily own Genesis horses.
Right.
So, I mean, like, obviously that requires a bit of research, and we're always happy to help new players do that.
There we go.
Thank you, BG. Yeah. So there you go. Most Z6 exclusives are going to be lower than a Z8 Genesis. And again, that most likely is largely because of the natural drop in base ability that comes with like breeding down 2 levels, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why people ask like about breed levels and whether or not, technically speaking, as far as I know, and as far as we've talked about, the breed level itself doesn't actually matter. The only thing about the breed level is that because there's a drop every time you breed, or there is a potential for a drop every time you breed, it's just more likely that a lower breed level, or a higher breed level, I should say, will have lower base ability just based on that. You could, in theory, if you are extremely lucky, have a Z4 exclusive Nakamoto that's just as strong as a Z1 Genesis Nakamoto, but you would have to be very lucky. In theory, this is all in theory, right?
Yeah, theoretically.
Yeah, theoretically speaking.
So yeah, I mean, Crumstain, we've kind of touched on this, but because Z20s and 30s, you generally have a couple butyrans in there who are going to be starting at lower average class or likely a lower base ability. Once you start putting, and you have the potential to drop from that, those horses are going to be less
So
likely to
Golden Glow.
have high base ability to what's going on, Golden Glow. Those horses are going to be less likely to be strong breeders, but again, because distance preference and because variance is so important in the racing environment, you can still have horses that are going to be competitive, up to certain class levels, that are Z30s, Z40s. I feel like I've seen, Z40s and Z50s that can win races and be competitive.
There's like a cross that's like fairly high Z. Like I'm pretty sure in the 40s or 50s that runs in class 3.
Yeah.
And gets like very competitive odds. I can't remember the name. I think it's Purple Refractor or something like that.
I know.
But again, it's important to remember that largely this is because of extremely high amount of variance, right?
Yeah,
And
that's right. That's right.
One thing that actually BG and I have gone back and forth on a few times is just whether or not it's possible to actually come out with a higher base ability than your parents. And, most signs point to the fact that if you're outperforming the base ability or average class of your parents, that can largely be attributed to base or to variance and distance preference rather than just necessarily having a higher base ability. But yeah, it's true, Lucky. I was gonna say the same thing.
Yeah, I haven't been looking at the race generation, but yeah, maybe they're watching and pushing some through for us.
I honestly, I don't know. I think the genotype purity. So this is kind of like going through a few other.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that I didn't miss any questions.
Do we want? I mean, I think we've kind of talked about.
Yeah,
this.
we kind of covered that, I think.
I mean, I think any lower or any higher Z horse, if you're breeding it back into a Genesis or a legendary that you think is strong, and then you get a good dose of a good dose of variance or distance preference on top of that, can be competitive. So you might not have a class 1 or class 2 superstar, but you can have a profitable horse. And I think we'll see more and more of that as as horses continue to be bred and raced. So yeah, in Golden Glow, I think we have it set up to auto send out a notice whenever we go live, but we can definitely double check that. Sorry if it didn't go out to everybody tonight. And then you started talking about genotype purity or genetic purity, CJ. I was going to say, from a breeding standpoint, it should have something to do with how much of their ability is passed on, or how often their ability is passed on, or something to that. The jury's still out on whether they've actually incorporated the purities into the current breeding system.
As far as the data that, at least talking to BG and the stuff that we've seen, there's no evidence that it exists or that it's been implemented or that it affects anything, that it's anything more than mythology.
Right. Lore. Yeah. No, I mean, there is a chance that it has something to do with the base ability being passed. But like CJ, like you said, the data generally suggests that it doesn't right now. That would be something that is relatively easy for them to implement pretty quickly into an updated contract or something like that, where they're taking the ability for the different bloodlines to pass down their ability or their genes to different. That would be kind of the simplest part of the genetic algorithm to implement, right? Because you just have a separate modifier on the ability that's passed down. So, and then mutation, again, there is some slight debate between us being CJ and I and BG on whether kids can be better than their parents right now. But the indication we have is that it's a relatively straightforward, percentage chance of base ability being transferred down. And generally that's going to be a drop. That's why we talk, 5 to 10% drop, potentially more, but unlikely. But there's some debate between us of whether there's a very, very small chance that the kids could be better than the parents.
So I like to think logically the chance exists for the child of any horses to be stronger than their parents. Maybe it's like a 1% chance. We know for sure that there used to be a very high or a relatively high chance of the foals being stronger than their parents. And that's why the quote unquote great reset happened I think it was in December or October or something.
December 2nd. Yeah.
Because the formula that they had for breeding at the time was overtuned to allow for the foals to become stronger than their parents far too quickly. So now with what BG has found in the data and what he's shown to us and what we've kind of looked at, most of it suggests that if there's a chance of a higher base ability, it's extremely, extremely low.
Yep.
And I don't know what this failed supercoat theory is.
Yeah. So, I was going to say, Bojack, I think you read our minds. We're probably going to raid Sean in a little bit. So stick around with us for a little while longer and then we'll jump over. But I appreciate you watching both of us for sure.
One more question.
So the failed supercoat theory was, we were talking about, I don't remember. It was a recent stream that I was watching. I was kind of lurking, where we were talking about supercoats being more likely to be better horses. Golden Glow, I'm sure you know what stream I'm talking about. You're welcome to mention it in chat, just to give some credit there. But because I don't think it was MJ. The question was, so do failed supercoats, do failed supercoat attempts, two horses with the same color breeding, end up being better racers because rather than getting the value of being a supercoat, you get, you have to have some compensation for that. And I was going to speak up in chat. Naruto was talking about it too. Okay. This was another stream that I was watching, I think, but those guys are good guys too. So what I was going to say was any research on color that we've done doesn't indicate any correlation with racing ability. But there are, I think it might be worth, CJ, it might be worth us asking BG to run some numbers there on trying to see what, if the same, because I think it would be a pretty easy check on same coat parents and what the average class or average racing ability would be. But
I think what you're going to find is that it really doesn't matter. I think
I would actually, I think it might actually be the opposite, because people that are color chasing, like I do, more often than I'd like to admit, they generally care less about breeding performance or breeding ability, right? They're just trying to find the best horse that they can for a reasonable price to try to get that supercoat. Oh, it was I think it was Zombie stream a couple days ago that we were talking about it there too.
We did actually see, I think it's percentage of positive ROI horses that super rare coats seem to have was it the highest? Yeah, I think honestly, like it's just like it's just a like a sample size thing. Like I think there's really no difference between the coats and their performance, and it wouldn't really make sense for there to be a difference.
Right. But I was just saying, if people care less about the performance of the horse or the breeding ability of the horse, and they're just going for the color, then there's a higher likelihood of the offspring having lower ability. So we can we can take a look. But I think in general, color has nothing to do with racing performance, unless you're one example of one guy who has I don't think he's watching tonight, but an all blue stable that has a ridiculous breeding record.
Blue horse is the best, right?
But color has no bearing on racing. But yeah, we'll definitely have to take a look, Golden Glow, at that, because I'm always interested to see that. I still say super rares and super coats are worse racers, but that's just more superstition than anything.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of theories and stuff in Zed is just people wanting something to be true more than it is likely to be true. And I think that this is something that I think we need to touch on at some point in the future about Zed in general. Is a lot of theories and a lot of beliefs that people have in this game is because they want to treat it more to be more realistic than it actually is, and they don't look at it as a game first. Hold on one second. Can we pull up my screen in a sec? I'm just gonna pull up Ray Del Mondo's racing history over the last little while. Here it is. Okay. Oh, actually, no, he won 2 races today, but it's still pretty bad. So, just for Bexel here, this is what you get with a super coat, right? Oh wait, how do I? Oh, it's because. Do
you want to share it?
Yeah, I'm just going to share it right here. So you can see super coats, really, really good racers in general. Actually, I just won 2 races tonight with him, so that kind of made it look a little bit better. But and actually brought him to ROI positive again, which is nice. That's right. But anyway, I'm actually getting pretty tired, so I don't know if you wanted to keep doing this or if you wanted to raid Sean versus all. I don't know if anyone else has any more questions. You could come to the Discord. We're always happy to help.
Yep. No, yeah, Alpha. That was a good comment to kind of sum up what we were talking about. So there is lore on the Zed site about different colors liking different distances, but distance preference for offspring is relatively random, and there's no correlation between colors and distance preference at this point. But again, that's another piece of lore that they could implement. Who knows? But right now it's just kind of colorful language that they have on the site. So, but yeah, with that, really appreciate you guys joining us tonight, sticking around with us. I know this is one of our longer streams recently. So appreciate all the good questions and everybody joining in the chat. Like we said, big stream on Sunday. We need to do some prep to get ready for that, but hopefully you guys can join that. We'll try to tweet out early when we're gonna have that. Come join us with Joe and Lacey, and I'm not sure if anybody else is going to join us, but we're definitely looking forward to that. And then we may or may not pop up tomorrow night and talk about racing and talk a lot more about specific horses. So if you can join, come join that. And Golden Glow, that's a good shout out. I forgot you guys were having BG on, so hopefully we'll be able to coordinate times to do a nice stream on Sunday, and then raid over to you guys. It will likely be mid to late afternoon on Sunday, just based on time zones and stuff like that. So, but keep an eye out for a tweet there. We're going to go ahead and raid Sean. Again, as I always say, a little bit higher energy than we are. A lot more focused on racing, but it's a great time. He's got a cool betting system that he has an overlay on Twitch, and you can jump in there. Bojack actually dropped a bet into our stream earlier by accident, so perfect little segue over there. And so, appreciate you guys joining. Keep an eye out for that. Let me set up this raid.
You want a stream of just shit talking? Is that what you're saying?
What's that? Oh, Dragnet. Yeah, that's the chill Friday streams, or the chill pop-up streams are for that. We talk about different horses and talk shit about different horses. So,
I was thinking about doing like a hot tub stream or something like that, just to kind of like,
you and me both, right? Yeah, that's right. So, all right, guys, we're gonna get this raid going. If you're on your computer, just stick around, and if you're on mobile, go ahead and join the raid. But again, appreciate everybody joining us tonight, and we'll see you all a couple more times. Jump in the Discord. Have a great night, guys, or great day. Bye.
Yeah, have a good night, guys. Thanks again.